The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. What does the most recent conflict between Israel and Hamas reveal about the Middle East peace process? I'd like to begin the program today by quoting from a statement that Benjamin Netanyahu released to the foreign press just last week. This is from November the 15th. The Prime Minister began by saying it was impossible for many Israelis to live a normal life while living under the constant barrage of missile fire. And then he went on to say, I want to remind you, now he's writing this to the foreign press, keep in mind, I want to remind you that 7 years ago, Israel withdrew from every square inch of Gaza. Now Hamas took over the areas we vacated. What did it do? Rather than build a better future for the residents of Gaza, the Hamas leadership, backed by Iran, turned Gaza into a terrorist stronghold. They fired thousands of rockets at our cities, at our towns, at our civilians, at our children. They've smuggled thousands of rockets and missiles into Gaza, and they deliberately placed these rockets and missiles in civilian areas, in homes, in schools, near hospitals. Now, there's no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, the Prime Minister went on to say. The terrorists are committing a double war crime, in fact. They fire at Israeli citizens, and then they hide behind their own Palestinian civilians, using women and children as shields. Now, that point seems to get lost in most of the news coverage that this conflict gets around the world. But rather than focus on that one point, I'd like to pick up on another point that the Prime Minister made in that statement. He said that 7 years ago, Israel withdrew from every square inch of Gaza. Now, when that happened back in 2005, many commentators said the evacuation of Gaza would be the first step toward achieving peace in the Middle East. Leaving Gaza would pave the way for a Palestinian state to coexist right alongside Israel. That's what so many were saying. But what is the reality? What has happened instead? Well, instead, Israel's departure opened the door for Hamas to take over and to establish a terrorist camp right next to Israel. Since 2005, Hamas has launched more than 8,000 rockets into Israel. Since 2005, Israel has gone to war against Gaza, it seems every few years, just to try to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure. I want to refer you to a couple of verses here today, Hosea 5 and verse 13 to begin with. If you want to go and get your Bible and read along, let me just, while you do that, let me just quote to you what the Trumpet had to say back in 2005. This was right after we saw those gut-wrenching scenes of the Israeli army having to pull Israelis out of their homes in Gaza, Israelis who didn't want to move, who didn't want to leave. And we wrote about that in November 2005 at the Trumpet, thetrumpet.com. We said, in addition to rending the hearts of Israel's citizens, the action only inflamed the fervor of Israel's foes and quite possibly handed the worst of those enemies a base of operations for the next phase in their war on the Jewish state. That's what we see happening. We're right here in the midst of the latest phase of this ongoing war against the Jewish state. 8,000 rockets launched since Israel left. Now let me read to you what it says in Hosea 5:13. The prophet writes, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, then went Ephraim to the Assyrian and sent to King Jareb, yet could he not heal you nor cure you of your wound. Judah there is referring to this little nation of Israel, and that word wound, if you look into the meaning of that Hebrew word in the Gesenius lexicon, it says the pressing together, binding up of a wound, here used figuratively, of a remedy applied to the wounds of the state. So it's talking about the remedy actually used to try to solve the problem. It's talking about the remedy as being the problem. The remedy is the wound, in other words. Now consider the past 19 years for a moment. Consider what has happened since the Oslo peace negotiations started in 1993. You look at that history today and you can easily see how much of a wound it has been for Israel for almost 2 decades. Israel's made numerous concessions based on the premise that the Palestinians would finally become satisfied and then turn into friendly neighbors. But with each concession, terrorist attacks have only increased. Now, some would say Israel maybe is finally awakening to the glaring falsehood of this land for peace strategy, but is it too little, too late? I mean, really, if you look at what Israel has left, they don't have much left in the way of territory. They don't have much territory left to give away, to try to appease the enemies. They can't very well pull out of any more areas. Now, I want to remind you what Ariel Sharon had to say back in 2003. This is almost 9 years ago, I guess. And he made this statement when he was campaigning for prime minister here in Israel. He said, "A unilateral withdrawal is not a recipe for peace. It's a recipe for war." He said that about Gaza. It was before the pullout. And he said, if we just unilaterally withdraw, that is a recipe for war. Now, it was Sharon who actually led the charge to persuade Israelis to settle in Gaza initially, going back to the Six-Day War, 1967. And for decades, he was encouraging Israelis to settle that region. And he saw that as a way to protect Israel's borders. In 2003, when he became prime minister, he was voted in largely because of his opposition to withdrawing from Gaza. But then in 2005, he completely reversed course, and Israeli forces and Israel citizens were removed from Gaza. And since then, Gaza has been a painful thorn in the side of Israel. Look at Israel's latest offensive in Gaza, the pillar of defense, as it's been called. Of course, the mainstream media will see this action as a massive attack, a huge offensive show of force. But looking at it more realistically, no matter how far Israel goes with this round of fighting, it won't be able to overwhelm the enemy. Hamas isn't going to be conquered with surgical strikes, and Israel will go out of its way to avoid civilian casualties, as it's repeatedly done. And so essentially Israel fights with one hand behind its back. It's got one hand tied behind its back. It's wounded. Now, Israel's enemies, on the other hand, will keep pushing. They'll keep pushing forward after every Israeli retreat. That is the reality. Now, let me quote to you what my father wrote in his booklet, Jerusalem in Prophecy. He said, "Through the peace process, Judah has become vulnerable to the enemy with very little freedom to strike back. Soon the whole world will see what the Arabs saw all along, that the peace process is a wound from which the Jews will never recover." Now, the truth is that Israel's deadly wound will eventually bleed this little nation to death. Look again at that verse, Hosea 5. This is verse 13. It says, "When Ephraim," that's speaking of modern-day Britain, "when Ephraim saw his sickness, and Judah," that's today's Israel, "when Judah saw his wound, then sent Ephraim to the Assyrian, and sent to King Jareb, yet could he not heal you, nor cure you of your wound." So finally, in a desperate diplomatic frenzy, you could say, Israel will cry out to the Assyrian, the presently uniting European power with Germany as its head. Israel will cry out to them for help, for protection, as its last hope for survival as a nation. It will one last time try to remedy its plight through a peace process or a peace pact. Now, my father wrote, again in that booklet, the Israelis will finally see their peace pact with the Palestinians has failed. The Jews really only see the effect of their wound. They don't see the cause. That is why they turn to Germany for another peace pact. This time, they place their trust in an even greater enemy. Once again, they fail to trust God. Catholic Europe has been waiting for years for just such a request. And by the time this request is made, it will have the necessary military might and power to respond to Israel's call for help. By that point, with anarchy reigning between Arab and Jew, Europe will intercede to fulfill its ambition, its long-held ambition in the Holy Land, and it will be anything but peaceful. Daniel 11:41 says that he, referring to the European power, shall enter also into the glorious land. That's speaking of Jerusalem, and many countries shall be overthrown. So it won't be a peaceful, it won't be a peacekeeping mission. Jesus Christ said in Luke 21:20, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is near. At the start, it may look sincere. It may seem like a sincere effort to establish peace and security in this region, but it will end up being a nightmarish repetition of the Crusades. The stage is already being set for this, but there is hope, and it's also revealed in the pages of Bible prophecy. As the outlook for Israel grows more bleak, God says the day will come when Jerusalem finally, rather than being a source of conflict, will become the focal point and the source of a genuine global peace. Now be sure to request our free booklet, Jerusalem in Prophecy, and as always, we thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.